can't just sit idly by and say, oh, well, the worst thing we've seen is XYZ. That does not necessarily mean that's the limit to the imagination and capability of nation states.
Welcome, listeners, to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions, who's going to introduce the subject and guest of our show today. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Joseph Price. He is a senior manager and the program lead for the OT cybersecurity program at Deloitte. And our topic is nation states, more or less. The word, credibility comes to mind. How worried should we be? I mean, how likely is the average site to be the target of a nation state grade attack? This is, the kind of thing that Joseph is an expert on.
Then without further ado, here's your interview with Joseph.
Hello, Joseph, and welcome to the podcast. Before we get started, can I ask you to say a few words of introduction? Please tell us a bit about your background and about the good work that you're doing at Deloitte.
Sure. Thank you very much, Andrew, for having me on. I've followed you, and it's exciting to be a part of your podcast. So thanks for this opportunity. My name is Joseph Price. I go by Joseph, and I'm zeroing in on about 30 years of being in cyber. I started back in the mid-90s with what we called information warfare. We didn't use the term cyber back then, as an active duty military officer in the Air Force. I spent about 4 years defending networks in various places around the world. And then I switched over into the offensive cyber side of things. I don't get to talk a lot about that, obviously, because details are not things we can discuss openly. But I will tell you this. The one thing of spending 16 years in that community is I didn't just learn about how we conduct offensive operations, but how other nations and other groups and organizations can conduct offensive operations, and really what they can do, whether we've seen it mentioned in the news or not. So I enjoyed about 20 years total working for the Department of Defense in various capacities. And after that, I moved here to Idaho Falls, Idaho, where I now live. I joined Idaho National Laboratory and was a deputy director for critical infrastructure protection there. And then 3 years ago, I shifted over to Deloitte & Touche, or just Deloitte if you prefer. And I'm a senior manager there and the program lead for our OT cybersecurity program. So I help develop our capabilities and service offerings and deliver them to our clients who have OT systems to help them secure and protect and create more resilient architectures that's supporting their OT systems. So that's where I focus now, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And the world needs more OT security. So thanks for that. Nation states is our topic. And, we read about nation state threats in the news. I work for a vendor. I go to a lot of these, face-to-face conferences. I hear a lot of vendor pitches. I'm sorry, a lot of vendors get up there and wave the nation state threat flag and, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The sky is falling, we're all going to die. And yet, here we are. You've been on the inside without stepping on anything you're not allowed to tell us. How accurate is the news? How, really what's going on behind the scenes? How worried should we be?
That's a great question. I think in the absence of details and information, a lot of times people just make presumptions about what a nation state might do. In terms of capability, nation states don't tend to just be opportunistic. There's a certain amount of opportunistic elements to any campaign, but they're not just necessarily saying, oh, let's see what we can find. Often actions are deliberate. Now, the problem we have is we don't necessarily know what they might target. So we might talk about a few examples or ideas around some things we've seen recently in the news. But for most processes, it's a deliberate activity. Nation states have the resources. They have access to talent. They have the patience to do things. So in many ways, we might conclude that, they're 10 foot tall and bulletproof. Now, that's not entirely true, but I think we are fooling ourselves to think that the best capability out there is some closely related version to what we've seen in the news when a particular operation was exposed. I think that capabilities are really only limited by imagination and one's dedication to a particular operation or operational objective. And so I tell people that yes, nation states are highly capable. They aren't necessarily, a lot of people say, well, do I have to worry about them targeting me? Well, that depends. But I would say on the whole, operational technology systems are more attractive for targeting for military or diplomatic purposes than IT systems. Or I should say they're attractive for a different reason. And that's, as we all know, those of us who try to defend them, is that impacts from the cyber domain can manifest themselves in the physical domain. And so if you think about it, you can achieve military goals, which may be to cause some destruction or to impact the availability of some critical resource, all through the cyber domain. And so I believe there's a lot of capability and a lot of emphasis and focus out there. And so we can't just sit idly by and say, oh, well, the worst thing we've seen is XYZ. Ukraine, they flipped a few breakers. That does not necessarily mean that's the limit to the imagination and capability of nation states at this time.
Andrew, to get us started here, we're talking about nation-state APTs. It could sound like it's all one thing, but in reality, we're talking about a wide tapestry of different threat actors from different places with different motivations. Which are the ones that we are most interested in this podcast today?
There's a lot of different capabilities out there. And, this is not comprehensive, but maybe just to give people sort of a taste of what's possible, let me cover off maybe a half dozen of the threat actors and sort of the different ways they approach the, nation state grade attacks. Start on the low end. Iran is accused of sponsoring hacktivist groups. Most recently they targeted some PLCs that were on the internet that were manufactured by an Israeli manufacturer. They, disabled water distribution in a small town in Ireland. And, doing this by sort of low tech, low investment targeting of internet exposed assets. North Korea has more sophisticated professionals that are paid every day. The hacktivists aren't paid; they're amateurs. The professionals are paid every day to attack things, and mostly what they do is ransomware, because this is how the sanctioned regime makes a lot of its foreign currency, is stealing it in ransomware attacks. So they've got some very sophisticated ransomware groups. China sort of is credited with bringing nation-state grade cyber attacks to the forefront. Back in the day, the DHS at the time in like 2006, 2007 put out alerts about advanced persistent threats. That was code for Chinese intelligence agencies. And they pioneered sort of the public use of what's now the classic remote access Trojan or remote access targeted attack, where you get a foothold on a network, you install a RAT, a remote access Trojan, a piece of malware. It calls to a command and control center on the internet, and you operate that malware by remote control. You use it to attack other machines on the compromised network. You spread the RAT to other machines. You might spread different versions of the RAT in case your first version is found out, and you establish a persistent presence. The very latest there is Volt Typhoon, which is saying there isn't even a RAT anymore. They're using the facilities in the operating system to maintain remote control. Extremely difficult to detect that the remote control is there. The Russians take a different approach. Historically, they've produced malware artifacts for attacks. Think Black Energy had code in it to manipulate, DNP3 devices. DNP3 is a widely used protocol in the electric sector. The latest out of Russia, or credited to Russia, I mean, none of this is officially confirmed, is Pipe Dream, which again is a code that has it's attack code that has a lot of capability in it for manipulating devices in control systems, presumably maliciously. And we haven't heard much about them lately, but back in the day, think 2010, American and Israeli intelligence was accused and has never officially accepted responsibility, but is widely thought to have produced Stuxnet, which is a very sophisticated artifact that once you let it loose in a target network, it just does its thing. It's autonomous. It spreads autonomously. It finds its target. It sabotages the target. It does not need remote control the way the Russian tools do, the way the Chinese prefer to sort of silently Volt Typhoon, living off the land, remote control systems. The Stuxnet was autonomous. So this is sort of the spectrum from low-tech hacktivist attacks to remote control attacks, some of which are very sophisticated, to autonomous attacks, some of which have been historically very sophisticated. And there's probably more that I've missed, but it's a sobering set of capabilities.
We read about these nation states in the news. A lot of the nation state grade attacks that make the news are espionage, breaking into governments, breaking into nonprofits, breaking into anybody who dares to voice any opposition to a regime, breaking into these places and stealing information. You mentioned a couple of instances, the Russia breaking into the Ukraine twice, causing, physical power outages. I guess the question is, we hear a lot comparatively about espionage, not so much about sabotage. Is there sabotage happening that just isn't being reported? What's going on there?
That's a great question, Andrew. And when I mentioned earlier that the activities you see in the news are not the limit of the capabilities of a nation state level actor, it's important to realize these are not singular transactions, especially when you consider targeting OT systems. This is a campaign, right? So it evolves over time. Sometimes our defenses are good and we catch them early on in the campaign. So even the simple acts within Ukraine 2015, where there are a number of circuits that were opened as part of that particular action, it started with a lot of information gathering, a lot of reconnaissance. We even saw right after the 2015 activity in January of 2016 that Ukrenergo, which is the transmission company that was later the target in December of 2016 of the follow-on attack, was part of a phishing scheme. And some of the particular people that they targeted in that scheme were protection engineers. So you start to put these pieces together and you realize they're looking at those people who are responsible for the overall protection system of the transmission network. And in December of 2016, rather than throwing several breakers in several different distribution companies, they threw one breaker in a transmission company. And it was something on the order, like an order of magnitude more power lost in that one breaker trip than in all the rest of 2015, during the 2015 attack. And so you realize that there's deliberate processes going on. And sometimes, like I said, we're lucky and we interrupt the process early. But the goal to attack a particular OT system, let's use the United States as an example target. The goal is not to let's get in there, gain access, pull all the information we can, and then cause sabotage. Because when your sabotage takes place in the physical realm, the chance of reprisal, the chance of anything from a diplomatic to a military response, certainly it rises considerably. But if you had those assets to hold at risk, if you can gain access, secure that access, and hold it at risk, you can integrate that, the whatever sabotage or whatever attack scenario into a suite of capabilities that you could have as part of a campaign plan. and it could be very effective too. So the adversary is going to use the most minimal force required to gain access. And if they can use something that, let's say, is out there in the wild, but they can tell you're not patched against, well, sure, they're going to use that. They're going to use that before they go to some 0-day that they know and no one else knows, right? You're going to be economical in your use of your various offensive crown jewels. Once they've gained a foothold, once they've secured their position, they'll need to do additional reconnaissance to figure out what are our options. I always felt that Ukraine 2015 was kind of a hastily executed operation, because so many things happened at once, and then they burned all the infrastructure at the end. But if you go back and look at each individual action that was taken at each of the distribution companies, you recognize that in some cases, they obviously had people that couldn't read or understand Ukrainian, because they had messages on the screen that they were remotely operating that said this is just a test system, and yet they continue to try to do things. They opened a tiebreaker, which in general, unless you're under some maintenance function, tiebreakers aren't going to shut the power down to anything. And so what we saw as things progress and you get into the December 2016 event, you realize that things are more specific to the equipment that's in use. It's highly targeted. They clearly had someone who knew what was going on in that system. And I think we need to recognize that a nation state adversary will understand your process. They may not understand your systems and exactly your processes for running through things or your contingency measures, etc., but they'll understand the physical process that you're controlling so that they can understand the effects they may have. And then they may just sit on that access, monitor it. It may only phone home once in a blue moon, because they don't need to risk detection by having frequent and regular communications or a massive amount of information flowing back and forth between that target. They have it there, they can hold it, and they can use it again for what I would say is, potential military or even just diplomatic influence operations, but without having to, take any physical action themselves. They can do it remotely. So I think that's something that is the reasons why they're not necessarily going straight to sabotage. It's not because, as I've seen in an article recently, oh, they wouldn't mess with us. No, actually, this is the exact way that people would mess with the United States. Attacking it asymmetrically, using capabilities to cause damage or to cause service outages or even uncontrolled environmental release, risk a safety basis or violate a safety basis and cause potential harm to humans. Those are all things that could be done from afar via the cyber domain. That's a nice capability to have, an arrow in your quiver, if you will, that nation states would want to hold on to for some future conflict.
The example you gave of, campaigns, developing capabilities, that sort of describes Volt Typhoon to a T. But in the news lately, there's been a lot of sort of lesser stuff. I mean, Russian, state-sponsored Russian activists are accused of, overflowing a water tank in Texas. Iran's nation-state-sponsored activists are accused of targeting an Israeli-made PLC that's used in a couple of small water systems and turning off the water to 180 people in Ireland for 2 days. None of this seems terribly consequential. I mean, what really is the goal here? That doesn't sound like a campaign.
Yeah, that's a great question, a great observation, Andrew. It's interesting and I think this is that tendency, I think, especially within the media, to presume that what we see is the totality of the operation. And I just don't think that's the case. So you mentioned a couple of really good examples. In fact, we had a very recent example on Monday. There was the Arkansas City, Kansas was also attacked. Its water authority was attacked Very little details have come out. I'm very interested to hear what they find and we're trying to get some additional details through some contacts. But because it on the face, it just looks like, well, not only did they not really have much of an effect, the plant in Arkansas City went into manual mode. Similar situation with some of the examples from Cyber Avengers, the ones you mentioned, attacking water authorities and kind of defacing the PLCs. The only place that actually caused an impact was that village in Ireland that you mentioned. And you're like, well, and now they're exposed. So, like you said, what did they really gain from that? And so my answer to that is, let's think deeper about the campaign. The campaign ultimately has, let's say, high value targets at the end of it. And maybe that high value target is a major municipal water system in the US, one that cannot be ignored if you were to have significant impacts against. So how do you target that? And everyone might think, okay, well, let's jump straight to, I'm going to learn about their systems if I can, who are the key people, I might start fishing, etc. But part of you has to ask, wait a minute, if we were to get caught early in the campaign and there were to be any reprisals, like would that completely wipe that campaign opportunity off the map? Do we need to use better tools? Do we need to invest more time in a human-related operation? You know, there's a lot of things to consider. And so even starting, you might say, how's the US going to react when we launch an attack and cause any impact whatsoever to a water system? Well, we need a lab environment, right? So I'm sure plenty of nation states, I'm sure they all have labs where they go test things out. But to really get hours to measure our response, they need to do it somewhere. Well, what is, if you consider large metropolitan areas, New York City, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Baltimore, those are going to get pretty big reactions pretty quickly for sure, right? A lot of people will know if something happens there. Well, what about Muleshoe, Texas? Probably not a large number of people even are going to know where Muleshoe, Texas is on the map. So we're going to hit some of these smaller rural areas. Number one, it's going to be an easier target, right? Because these water authorities suffer from what I call STP, same three people. The same three people are responsible for making sure they have all the necessary chemicals for treatment of the water, that the water sourcing and distribution all works. They go and deal with issues. They've got to handle and manage the budget. They've got to handle the maintenance calls, the late night calls of issues, the water main breaks, all those things. Same three people are responsible for everything. So it's a pretty good bet they're not going to have high-end cybersecurity capabilities. So, and then we're going to do something. We're going to take an action. And that action isn't going to directly cause loss of life or anything major like that. So they had to go into manual operation mode. Big deal, right? That of all the potential impacts, that's probably the least. Not for those same three people, because now they're probably a lot busier, even more so than usual. But, that's going to give us a window to, does that cross a threshold? How fervent is the US's response at the executive level, at the DHS CISA level, at the state governor's level? How do we respond as a community, as a nation, when we recognize that a foreign actor is taking action against these life-critical, services that we just take for granted every day? And so I think that, again, part of the campaign is figuring out where are those limits to government response. What's going to trip a greater response or something? What will those responses look like? It's no different in my mind, like when you have Russian bombers flying into our air defense identification zone up near Alaska. They're not crossing into our national airspace, but they're in those areas just outside of it. And they watch with their radars and their surveillance planes how quickly we scramble, how quickly we are able to intercept their aircraft, what tactics we use. I believe that's also going on here, because in the end, if we believe, so one of the things I mentioned earlier was, hey, we can't guide our greatest adversaries' capabilities based on what we see in the news. I was quite honestly shocked in 2019 when the Director of National Intelligence published an unclassified threat assessment, and in it identified a couple of interesting facts. Number one, they named Russia and China in there, which, for those of us who have worked with the intelligence community before, it wasn't surprising that those were the potential adversaries they named. What was surprising is that they were saying this at the unclassified level, and it said that Russia could cause a power impact, an impact to our power, whether it be generation or distribution, that could last from hours to days. That China could impact our water systems in such a means to last from days to weeks. Like, those are pretty bold statements coming out in an unclassified intelligence report. So I think there's a recognition at other levels of the government that nation state adversaries do have a greater capability than what we might presume just by watching the media. And the smaller activities, yes, they could be isolated incidents. In the case of the Cyber Avengers, they were trying to deface the HMI screen on Israeli-made equipment. Okay, that might have been an isolated campaign, but for the other things, I sit there and I think, how could this be used as part of a larger, more diverse campaign to see how we respond, to see what we put in place as a result of those attacks, and how can we use that as part of our higher value target operations and preparing for those to have capabilities there. So
there is something new in the world. Waterfall's Hera Gateway is hardware-enforced remote access for OT networks. What does hardware-enforced access mean? It means that even if both internet-facing CPUs in the Hera device are completely compromised by a zero-day or a stolen credential, even if they are compromised, the attacker still cannot pivot their attacks through the hardware into the OT network. Hera's hardware saves us. This is true interactive remote access with hardware-based protection from cyber attacks. For details, please visit waterfall-security.com/Hera, that's HERA, Hera, or visit the Waterfall Security Contact Us page and request a briefing with an expert on Hera, hardware-enforced remote access.
If I were to summarize the one sort of surprising thing that I took from the detail is the concept of a campaign. It's not just that small water systems are easier targets, and so let's go after them. It's, I never really thought of these attacks as stepping stones. I really hadn't thought of these attacks as testing our response capabilities. I mean, the one concrete example that springs to mind is, I forget, it was a few years ago, the American administration announced that, attacks on critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, would be regarded as acts of war. Well, someone just overflowed a water tank in Texas. Did anyone declare war? No. So yeah, it does, it almost does feel like, people are pushing a little bit, the bad guys are pushing a bit to say, well, really, when would you respond? How would you respond? This makes sense.
True. And what I didn't hear him say that I believe is also occurring is when nation-state APTs use one of their targets as a springboard or a relay point to another. So, for example, you are targeting one major utility or telecommunications organization or whatnot. You go after a smaller target, and then you can use that as a relay point to hide your malicious communications, for example, among other things.
Where I have heard of that is in supply chain more than targeting one critical infrastructure to get into another. You tend not to have that kind of connection between a smaller water utility and a larger water utility, in my recollection, at least in North America. You might have stronger connections like that in Europe, where things tend to be sort of closer to each other, more connected. So yeah, that's a good point.
So work with me. We've been talking about the threat, and I'm convinced that the nation state threats are real. The question becomes, what do we do about them? The truism, I don't know if it's true, but the truism is that a nation state military essentially has unlimited money and talent and time to come after us. And when you have that coming after you, it's hard to imagine how you could stop an attack like that. Given what you've said about the threat, we as defenders, from small water systems to large high-speed passenger rail switching systems, we as defenders, what should we be doing about the threat?
The challenge in answering that question is that the problem is multidimensional and multifaceted. But in general, I believe what we should be doing first and foremost is recognizing that this is a business risk or an operational risk, not a technical risk. So often, when you bring up the topic of a potential cyber attack, let's say you're talking to a CEO or a board, well, they're gonna be like, well, go talk to the CISO or go talk to the CSO, right? That's their responsibility. But when we consider that impacts can directly impact the business, whether we're brewing beer or providing clean drinking water to millions of citizens, the ability for cyber to now create business impacts means it should get some degree of attention. And the consideration for what should be done should not be reserved to, well, I did the minimum. I followed the checklist. I'm compliant with this standard. Because as we all know, in any standard, your interpretation, your finding for how you've met that standard, the exceptions that you might apply for and get granted for that standard, all could become your own undoing. So to start with, how do we talk about security of OT systems to thwart the business risk? When you have attention at that level, then you start to recognize the investment that's made in any business activity, whether it's bringing on new equipment, whether we're upgrading, let's say we're a utility and we're upgrading to we're a large provider and we're upgrading to a new energy management system, right? Part of that capital expense is the security. And with that, we're not trying to meet some minimum required amount. We're recognizing that just as the adversary is dynamic and can be active at different times, we need to make sure that our systems are actively monitored, that there is a responsibility, whether it's done locally by organically within a given company or provider, or if it's contracted out, or if there's some higher level organization that provides that. We talked earlier about rural water systems and the fact that you've got maybe the same three people are responsible for everything. It's unreasonable to go tell the community of Muleshoe, Texas, or Du Bois, Idaho, hey, you have to come up with and fund your own cybersecurity expert. And oh, by the way, you've got to pay him or her a healthy sum because there's a lot of demand in the market, and they're gonna cause a hefty price. But what we could look at is to say, okay, the threat to those smaller water systems is not only is it probably lower in terms of somebody trying to cause sabotage, that is probably lower. Also, the resulting impact, if that rural community were without water for, let's say, hours to days, there are means at certain levels of government, state, federal, etc., to help compensate for that temporary outage. It is a lot harder to compensate as the population served by that water system goes up, or the demand on that water system goes up considerably. So there's still challenges within certainly agricultural areas and things like that rely on the water supply for growing crops, etc. But if you could, instead of telling every individual function you're responsible for your own defense, you do give them some minimum amount of requirement, or maybe even assist them in meeting some minimal safe configuration. A firewall that's properly configured to serve business, to allow business purposes, but not allow unsolicited communications in from the outside. You have some continuous monitoring on there, even if it's not monitored by those individuals, by that particular water authority. But look at like the state level, and look at, there are emergency response centers popping up in all states, and being able to handle different incidents, right? Some sort of incident management or incident response capability at the state level, and maybe you bring it up there. I've always said, when I look at the state of Idaho, we have 3 kind of population centers in Idaho Falls, Pocatello, where I live on the southeastern side, the capital city of Boise in the southwest side, and then the town of Coeur d'Alene, not that far from Spokane, Washington, up in the northern end in the Panhandle. So you might be able to attract some talent to those population centers and have a regional secure operations center for, let's say, the water sector. When we pivot over to power, now you're talking about, well, you have regulated utilities, you have NERC-CIP, certainly a lot more investment in what is being done right now to set the bar to begin with for regulated utilities. You also have private owner operators, right? You have companies that might have a little more bandwidth, if you will, within the budget to be able to do things. And so you might require more self-sufficiency in that kind of scenario. Because in the end, what you don't want to do is pass all of these costs onto the consumer. I think we all probably pay for it one way or another, but you don't want to suddenly triple somebody's water bill or their power bill to say, oh, well, we have to do this, this particular cyber thing because we have these particular requirements. You want to look at how can I pool resources and use, where it makes sense, other sources of funding and support for those activities where it's just not feasible to bring the talent or the capability and run it organically within that organization. I think if we, then we start to expand to the federal level and say, what's the federal government's responsibility? Now, to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of my company or the Department of Defense, my former employer, or anyone like that. But I did notice that recently Jen Easterly, the director of SCADA, started talking about pushing responsibility for software vulnerabilities onto the vendors themselves, or software or hardware. So that is one tact that can be taken, is you start spreading that around the equipment and software manufacturers, in addition to requiring the owners operators to provide some level of protection, in addition to looking for communities of interest that might be able to come together and assist in providing active monitoring where it's just not feasible to have the organic capabilities. So those are some of the ways that I think, getting off the dime and thinking that this is just an issue of like for checklist security, that no, we need to move beyond that, and we need to be actively monitoring our systems, and we need to be able to share that information. We've got a great model. We've got information sharing analysis centers, ISACs out there. Let's make sure that they're properly funded and resourced so that when something does happen in Muleshoe, Texas, or in Arkansas City, Kansas, that information can be pulled in quickly and shared elsewhere, so that if part of that campaign is hitting multiple small utilities, you can make them aware and quickly disseminate even response measures to help protect against them or to counter anything that's been done. I think those are some ways we can start getting after this problem. But it requires a shift in our thinking that this is a CISO problem, or this is just the network shop's problem to solve. As I was talking about what we should do, how we should sort of change our approach. I'm reminded of when I attended my first SANS ICS security conference in 2015. I had just less than a year ago moved to Idaho from Germany. I knew Mike Asante, who many in this community, if they've been around at all, know who Mike Asante is. And I was listening to somebody give a talk at that conference. Kim Zetter was in attendance, and she's the author of the book Countdown to Zero Day. And so almost every speaker up to this, I think we were on day 2, almost every speaker had received some sort of question about Stuxnet, right? And based on Zetter's book. And they wanted to know, how do I protect against, the nation state level attack that is Stuxnet? And the speaker, I forget his name, but he said, I find it kind of funny. He said, everyone's sitting here going around saying, how do we solve against Stuxnet? He's like, most of you don't even know what assets you have on your network. So there's probably a prefatory comment to be made, which is, if you have no cybersecurity program, or maybe a very nascent one, you can be bombarded with all these different tools that people will bring you, or say, oh, bring us on and we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you. And it can become quite noisy and confusing. What is the best step I should take? What are the first steps I should take? And so I will caveat my previous response by just saying, consider first and foremost knowing yourself, knowing what you have on your network, identifying that. And certainly there's automation and tools that can assist you in doing that. But know what you have some sort of policy so that you know how you're going to treat these systems, right? And there's lots of policy examples out there. You can use somebody to assist you in that, or you can, if you've got the ability, you can study examples that are out there. But know what you have some policies how you're going to treat, whether onboard, offboard that equipment, dispose of it, how it's going to be configured, how you're going to let users access, and then put some sort of monitoring capability in place so that you can assess what is going on. And then you can start to graduate to the more complex cases. How do I need to integrate threat intelligence? How do I do attack surface management? What are my exposures to a very highly capable adversary or an advanced persistent threat? It's important to recognize that you can't just make all that happen overnight. So I would just say, broadly, we need to think about monitoring, active monitoring, having responses, rehearsing our incident response plans, knowing what assets we have in our systems. If we can get there, then I think as a nation, we'll be better prepared to start dealing with the more nuanced and advanced threats, and being able to respond when we see a noise somewhere in the system and recognize that might be part of a broader campaign. How do I need to respond to whatever happened there to make myself more protected, more resilient?
So Nate, what struck me there, long discussion of what smaller utilities can do, how important, detection is. I'm reminded of the incident in Denmark. The Sector Cert documented the Russians compromising some 22 internet-facing firewalls that they'd been monitoring. What is not widely known about that incident is the funding model for the Denmark Sector Cert. The Sector Cert is not publicly funded. It serves some 200 or 300 utilities, most of which are tiny. It serves 3 large utilities. I don't know if they're power or water, but 3 large utilities is my recollection when I was talking to these people. I might have the numbers off by 1 or 2, but it's a very small number of large utilities, and those large utilities pay for the Sector Cert. And the Sector Cert provides its services to the hundreds of tiny utilities for free. what's the benefit? Well, part of it is the larger utilities giving back to society. Part of it is in sort of the analysis, Joseph's analysis here. Part of it is the larger utilities benefit from visibility into what's going on in the smaller utilities. If the smaller utilities are being attacked as part of a larger campaign, the larger society, the larger utilities want to know what steps the enemy is taking, want to know how much trouble they're in. So this is an interesting funding model. He's right. The same three people do not have the skills, nor the ability, nor the money to set up their own monitoring system, to pay for their own threat intelligence feeds. Whereas a central sector search style organization that is sort of providing service to the smaller utilities can afford to buy threat intelligence feeds from the commercial providers of these things, can afford to have a relationship with their government and get access to classified information. Having sort of the big fish, be it the government or the larger utilities, pay for these services for smaller utilities seems to me to make a lot of sense in terms of a funding model to bring about the kind of capabilities that Joseph is talking about.
What I kind of heard you say was the perspective of the government. I mean, in the United States, the federal government, in other nations, the national government, may be somewhat different from the perspective of the tiny utilities with the same three people. You've talked about the need for monitoring. Absolutely, the nation needs to monitor these campaigns and figure out, how many doors is the enemy knocking on. But in terms of monitoring, most small utilities, they want, the attacks kept out. They don't want to focus on the detect part of the NIST cybersecurity framework. They want to focus on the protect part. And to me, this is them saying, well, we can, if the nation wants, insight into my systems, let them pay for the monitoring, because that's benefiting the nation, not me. I need to put protection in. For those small utilities, when they're designing their security program, should there be assistance? I mean, I don't want to, again, I guess I don't want to drift into monetary. How much should the small utility be focused on sort of assisting the nation in terms of detecting widespread campaigns? And, how much of the nation state threat should each small or large utility regard as credible threats to their own user base, their own citizens?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let's start by recognizing that, as we discussed earlier, as I mentioned earlier, smaller utilities are not going to have the resources or access to the skill sets to take on all the responsibilities on their own. And I agree with you. Let's not drift too much into the policy of who pays, et cetera. But let's think in terms of where is that expertise. Who can assess what is credible and what is not? I pause a little bit at the use of that term, because if we talk about in engineering, if we talk about design basis threats, I mean, we look in terms of, okay, I have two gears are made of a certain metal. We put them together. They're going to turn. We're going to use some sort of lubrication or something. But I can, with relative accuracy, predict when that's going to fail or when it needs to be replaced to avoid it failing in operation, right? Because we know how metals break down over time and exposed to certain elements and temperatures, et cetera, and stresses. When we look at measuring risk for natural disasters, we look historically. We rely on the fact that, well, there's a 30% chance that we're going to have a hurricane between categories 1 and categories 2 strike somewhere within this 100 miles of our shoreline, in the next 3 years. We base everything off of the historic occurrences and use that and extend that into a probability statement for it happening again. The challenge we have in cyber is there's in in most cases, there's a human actor involved. And really, at some level, there's a human actor deciding to take certain actions. And so when you start talking about, is the threat credible? Do I need to be worried? It's very difficult. I think you'll get some broad statements made based on how critical that service or that utility or that function is. And then you'll think in terms of how likely is it that a nation state level adversary would want to have that impact on them. And I say, well, again, go back to our earlier conversation. I think holding that infrastructure at risk is a much bigger coin in their pocket than causing some impact. So for that reason, I look at, in terms of prioritizing and looking at credible threats, I think, okay, if you could either cause interruption of a critical service like water, power, transportation in a large metropolitan area, there is the potential of bending political will. Right? I always tell people, why is the U.S. Navy such a, the most powerful fighting force, on the seas anywhere in the world? Well, it's because they can park a dozen acres of sovereign use territory 12 miles off somebody's shore and give them pause, give them time to think and recognize that, maybe whatever action that prompted that, there might be a diplomatic solution to. Well, if suddenly the populace of the U.S. or a significant number of the populace of the U.S. are threatened with the loss of life-critical services, I think we'd be foolish not to believe that might give us political pause, right? That might cause, the executive branch to think carefully, what is the next move? If they could hold that large of a population at risk, what are our options? Now, I'm sure it will drive multiple different options, political, military, etc.
It occurred to me when you're talking here, is it credible that, Volt Typhoon is in the news, living off the land, extremely difficult to detect these adversaries.
Right.
Is it reasonable to believe that hundreds of other utilities have been compromised in the same way, and the Chinese deliberately leaked the fact that they've taken over these 50 odd this way, to make the authorities aware that this capability exists? Because it does no good to hold, when the Navy parks off the shore of some other nation and says, let's think twice about this. The sort of the response capability, the capability of the Navy is clear. Okay, these ships are sitting there. If nobody knows that the Chinese have the ability to cause widespread physical consequences, is it credible that the Chinese leaked Volt Typhoon, deliberately or really accidentally, but weren't that dismayed by it, because they have these other capabilities, and it does, those other capabilities do no good as a threat if nobody knows they exist?
So that's a great question. Volt Typhoon, in my mind, is an example of, or I would say it's an exposition of an extended campaign, right? As you're well aware, as you mentioned in your question, it uses living off the land techniques, very difficult to detect. And in fact, in the infection details that I reviewed, in the instances of Volt Typhoon attacks that I reviewed, quite often they say we have no idea how they landed. And so that, to me, reeks of an extended campaign of holding assets at risk. Because once you have them, number one, remove all traces of how you got there. Two, use living off the land techniques to maintain that access. And like I said, occasionally, phone home. And when I say phone home, it's probably to some other listening post so that you know you have access. But if you've done that and you sit back and say, haha, we have all these infrastructure operations that we hold at risk, do you need to actually cause sabotage or create mayhem to be able to have an effect? The answer is no. But it might be worth letting them know you have a certain amount of assets held at risk. Now, if you're smart, and I believe our nation state level adversaries are very smart, you're not going to, let's say, manage and care for all of the places you hold at risk with the exact same infrastructure, right? You're going to spread it around. The technique by which you connect with them and contact them, do any of your maintenance of that connection. If you do collect information, you'll use different infrastructure to get that back, that information back to you. So you don't necessarily have to burn the entirety of your targets held at risk, but you absolutely could take a portion, leak sufficient information, or maybe it was found because of just great sleuths looking carefully at crash dumps. But the point is, at some point, when your target knows they've been owned significantly, you might have leverage to, let's say, accomplish some diplomatic objective or some other political objective short of military conflict or things of that nature. That might be very helpful in, let's say, talks that are upcoming about trade or about conditions in adjacent territories or other nations that are allies to one of the countries in question and not to the other. I mean, there's a lot of ways that could be useful, and again, it causes a response. You see how willing is the target to negotiate as a result of recognizing you hold some of their key infrastructure at risk. So I think that also would explain, in my mind, why the government has been so united and adamant that we do what is necessary to root out and to identify and cleanse Volt Typhoon from our systems. It's a compelling conjecture, and again, this is all conjecture. Neither one of us is talking from a position of some greater knowledge of exactly what's happening or what happened with Volt Typhoon, but it certainly makes sense to me that you would possibly burn some of your infrastructure to sort of, or show one of your cards or maybe two of your cards to give you leveraging power in whatever's going on globally or between those nations at that time.
Well, Joseph, this has been sobering. Thank you for joining us. Before we let you go, can you sum up for us? What are sort of the key things we should take away from this nation-state threat business?
I would say the first nugget is, let's keep in mind that the capabilities of any adversary are not merely defined by what we read in the news, what events or activities were essentially caught and then publicized. Computers will do exactly what we tell them to do, right? The computers and digital devices that run our OT systems are not all that different from the ones that are running our IT systems. And if someone with sufficient access and authority tells it to do something, it will absolutely do it. And when those logical actions are tied to physical systems or impacting the physical world, again, the range of potential effects are limited by our adversaries' limitations. They're limited by our adversaries' imagination, and further by what we do to actively defend and protect those systems from maloperation. The other point that I would say to keep in mind is that we can't protect everything against everything. We need to prioritize. But if you consider where OT systems and OT cybersecurity is, I often feel like we're 20 years or more behind of where we are with IT. And yet these are the systems that most affect our day-to-day lives. And an impact of them would be felt much stronger. I always tell people, somebody hacks my computer and gets my online banking password, it's a bad day for me. But if someone goes in and hacks a power distribution substation, or if they hack the water treatment facility, it's a bad day for a whole lot of people. So there's a certain degree of scale and, again, reliance upon our critical infrastructure, and we should give it due diligence, and that includes resourcing, funding, attention to those systems over and above some of the other areas that we maybe emphasize right now. And then the last nugget is recognizing that these capabilities are out there obviously doesn't hit the easy button on solutions. So there's really no excuse to, I would say, having basic levels of hygiene. But in order to achieve that and move on to, like you said earlier, right, protecting, not defending when they're already there, but protecting against these capabilities, then we really need to take a much more active role, and we need to move the decision from maybe the lower end of the C-suite to the higher end. And certainly for OT systems, again, whatever it is, whether you're manufacturing something, manufacturing pharmaceuticals, or treating wastewater in a city, those OT systems control your business. And therefore, it is a business risk that takes the attention of not just a CSO or a CISO, but the CEO, the COO, the board even. Those who recognize that the proper investment needs to be made to protect these systems that are core to whatever service or product they provide. I've really enjoyed getting to be on this podcast, Andrew. This is an area that's been near and dear to me for quite some time. Like you, I've spent a lot of my career focused on cybersecurity in various areas. The last 10 of it solely focused on OT systems. I work at Deloitte. I have to tell people when I show up, hey, I'm not here to do your taxes, because that's what Deloitte is often known for, as a tax and audit company, which it is that for sure. But we also have, for 12 years running, the largest cybersecurity consultancy within the United States. And so if anyone wants to learn more about how Deloitte can assist them in tackling some of these challenges, I urge you to go to www.deloitte.com and look at the services there. You can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can connect you to if there's an interest to have the professional discussion. But in the meantime, Andrew, great podcast. Again, I really appreciate you inviting me and allowing me to come on here and talk with you about these subjects with you. You've actually encouraged me to think a little bit deeper on some things too, so I'm excited.
I'm delighted to hear it. Thank you so much. The podcast would be nowhere without guests like you, experts coming in and sharing. I call it a piece of the elephant. Show us a face of the elephant, and the nation state face is something a lot of people, like I said, bandy about. But it's tremendous to be able to dig into it in some depth. Thank you so much.
So I know it's just one little sentence and a much longer answer there, but Joseph mentioned that in his view, IT was like 20 years ahead of OT security. which struck me as very surprising. In what universe is IT that far ahead, if ahead at all? I mean, based on the conversations we have here, these are much more in-depth, technical, forward-thinking conversations than I tend to have with people in IT.
I fear that your perspective on OT security has been tainted by 100 episodes of the podcast here. Partly, on the podcast we interview people who are very active in OT security, and sort of the examples I give out of my own experience at Waterfall, we work with the most cyber secure, industrial operations on the planet. We're on the very high end of industrial cybersecurity. So, you've been sort of seeing that side of the coin. Joseph, in my recollection, he worked at Idaho National Laboratory, working with lots of different kinds of stakeholders in the OT security space, large and small, advanced and not. At Deloitte, he's working with presumably a very wide cross section of the industry. Much more so than we have on the show here, much more so than I have in my practice. The sort of the leading edge of industrial cybersecurity is very sophisticated. The average is probably much closer to what he's pointing out, saying, no, there's a lot of people out there. We had an episode, I don't know, a year ago, talking about starting from zero. We interviewed a gentleman who made it sort of his calling to walk into industrial sites who had done absolutely nothing, one after another after another. So there's a lot of zero out there. What I took away from the episode, was sort of two things. One is it was sobering, thinking about sort of bigger picture campaigns. I have been focused on sort of individual breaches, individual sites. What can the small sites do? I wasn't really thinking about how a multi-site campaign might work and what would be the advantages to a nation state in carrying out such campaigns. So that's sort of some sobering food for thought. The other thing I took away, again, I'm reminded of the Denmark sector CERT model, where the largest utilities, or presumably if you'd rather the government, but big fish pay for a facility that A, protects the little fish because it's the right thing to do, and B, provides intelligence to the big fish about large-scale campaigns that might be feeling their way through the little fish in the course of, eventually targeting the big fish. That, to me, that's a nugget of solution here that maybe we should be, as a society, considering applying more widely.
All right. Well, with that, thank you to Joseph Price for speaking with you, Andrew. And Andrew, as always, thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure, Nate. Thank you.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everyone out there listening.